Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Pamela, you can hear me back there? Yep. All right, good. I'm going to try to keep this volume the whole time. It's a pleasure to be here. Pastor Danielle talked about how we reconnected, and I just think it's so awesome, the type of church that you have here, the way that you've envisioned church makes sense to me. And I know that people here have different beliefs and all kinds of, there's an openness to having all kinds of people here, and I think that that's awesome. So I'm going to start by opening this up to bring you all in. We're going to talk about interpreting the Bible. But first, I want to hear an issue. Pick an issue, a topic, a problem, anything. Issue. Hopefully it's important to you.
Climate change.
Climate change. Your name is? Monica said climate change. Climate change is an issue. Climate change is an issue that people who read the Bible have said things about. Am I right? We didn't plan this ahead of time. So, climate change. What does the Bible say? Well, who has a Bible? Anybody bring a Bible? Oh, people brought phones. People brought phones. That's all right. I have a Bible here. Let's find out what the Bible says about climate change. You ready? Try. You want to hear? You want to try? I'll bring it closer. Oh, you got the answer. All right, so some people can find out what the Bible says just like that. But for most of us, when we want to know what the Bible says about anything, there's a part that we do to make meaning out of the Bible. Actually, there's a lot that we do. At a most fundamental level, we got to decide, what is the Bible? Is it my Protestant Bible? Is it this particular translation of my Protestant Bible? We're in a synagogue. Is it the Torah? Okay, let's say you're a Christian, so you're going to say it's not the Torah. Is it the Christian Bible that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has, or that the Catholic Church has, or the Protestants have? Those Bibles aren't the same. So if you're talking about one issue, which Bible? Okay, let's see you figured out which Bible. Which verses are you going to look at? And if you do look at verses that don't say the same thing, which one's more important? And as you go on, there's a million more questions that we end up asking. You say, okay, what is in your Bible? Which verses are relevant? What is God like? You have an idea of God, and that's going to influence how you make meaning of whatever you see in the Bible. What is at stake? Oh, I'm sorry. That's not the next one I have. Is the Bible authoritative? What does authority of the Bible mean? Well, plenty of people say they go to the Bible for a big issue like climate change, but don't all have the same idea of what it means for the Bible to speak towards that issue as an authority. How does that work? And the questions go on and on. It stopped. The questions do go on and on, whether this clicking works or not. Okay, the questions go on and on. I talk about this with my students in a classroom setting where they're able to wrestle with a lot of these different questions, a lot of the different perspectives that go into us constructing meaning out of the Bible. When you have anything you're trying to figure out, we do a lot of that work. And it takes several classes for me to get through this topic. We take about 4 classes in an intro class at the beginning of the year. We're not going to take that much time here. You're going to have to trust me a little bit. But what it comes down to is that there's all these different factors, different questions that are in mind. And a lot of them we don't intentionally think about when we're interpreting the Bible. They're subconscious, or they've already been addressed. Maybe we got someone else's answers because that's the only answer we ever knew. Maybe we never bring up the question at all. But these are all things that are part of how we interpret the Bible. So, we make a difference in terms of, where am I going with this? We make a difference in terms of how we interpret the Bible. What happens if we choose to be intentional? Imagine this. You have to be creative. Imagine this. What if there was a church that didn't tell you what to believe, but told you we're here because we share values, like love? What if that was like really important to a church? And relationships, including a relationship with the earth. What if a church said that? And then they're going to start with those values and figure out how they're going to interpret the Bible. Can you imagine a church like that? Yeah. What if, people online, in case you don't know, that's this church. I have a colleague at Louisville Seminary where I teach, and he's all about religious pluralism. Imagine if like a church and a synagogue could get along and yeah. So he talks about respecting our religious neighbors who, let's say we have a conversation, a dinner, a friendship with them, and we have no intention to convert them to Christianity, right? We don't think they're going to hell. We respect our differences, and we celebrate our differences. He said, that's how we think about religious pluralism. At the same time, though, unfortunately, very often, Christians who believe that haven't been taught how to read their Bibles in a way that fits with what they already believe. And so he says you end up with us passing down certain ways of reading the Bible that don't fit with the way you've already changed what you value. So I'm talking about something similar, experimenting with critical race theory and ideas about justice. I'm experimenting with how we can be intentional with the meanings we make of the Bible, with ideas from critical race theory because I find it convincing, and ideas about justice in mind as a guide as we read the text. And hopefully that would make what we find in the Bible when we're making meaning out of these texts more coherent with what we value, what we say these are our values. If we value racial justice, these ideas might fit better with how we start reading the Bible. We might find that Scripture says something different. So, critical race theory and justice. Can you all see this tiny screen? Not really. I have one person. Say your name one more time. Monica can see this screen. Monica, what do you see? You have to illuminate the image for everybody else. What do you see, Monica?
I see plants.
Monica sees plants. How are they doing?
They're flourishing.
These are plants that are flourishing. This is a slide where I'm trying to show you visually some idea of justice. Monica says these are plants that are flourishing. What is justice? One definition of justice that I like is the idea that justice is a process where people decide and create the conditions that help us thrive. And it involves the people who are most impacted by those conditions. Justice is a process where people decide and make conditions for us to thrive, and it involves those people who are most impacted by those conditions. An idea, so this definition is a quote from Derica Purnell. She's not the only one that thinks of justice this way. I just like the way she writes it. There's a lot of other ways to think of justice. This is one that I find attractive. So if you look at that garden, we see these plants thriving. Looks like they're thriving. What conditions needed to be created for these plants to thrive? That's an idea of justice. You also might turn a critical eye to this garden. You might say, well, did that thriving happen by removing certain plants, right? What does it take to make the conditions for all of us to thrive? That's the question of justice that I'm thinking about. All right. What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a Marxist plot to teach your children how to take over the world. Beware, beware. I'm sure that's the soundbite that's going to end up all over the place. Critical race theory, at the most basic level, and this is not enough to say what it is, but this is the most basic level, is the study of and work to transform unjust relationships among race, racism, and power. The study of and the work to transform unjust relationships among race, racism, and power. Now that's too simple of a definition. That's a start. But with that simple definition, so you'll see that in, for example, a very common introduction to critical race theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk. You'll see it there. And if somebody just stops there, then you can put all kinds of things as critical race theory. You all have had, for example, Esau McCauley come here and talk to you about, well, actually it was a Zoom call, and he talked to you about how he interprets the Bible, and he cares about transforming unjust relationships between race, racism, and power, but he'll say, I'm not doing critical race theory. He says what he's doing comes from the black ecclesial tradition. He says this is how black people have been interpreting the Bible for a long time, before there was even the term critical race theory, and I'm doing it in a very Christian way. That's what he'll say. There's tons of things that are not critical race theory that are about transforming those unjust relationships. Critical race theory is better understood by how it deviates from what it's building off of, which is conventional civil rights. So, civil rights movement happened in the 60s, or in the 50s. You get Brown v. Board of Education. You get a lot of changes, legal changes in the 60s, but by the late 70s and the 80s, people are saying, hey, a lot of this stuff is being blocked. Schools are just as segregated as they were after Brown v. Board of Education was supposed to end school segregation. What's happening? And so critical race theory developed out of a reaction to that, to say, well, it seems like there were ideas about race, racism, and power in the civil rights movement that might have seemed like they made sense, but they're not really working. And so we need to rethink those ideas. And so critical race theory came out of rethinking those ideas. Derek Bell started thinking about what was wrong with Brown v. Board of Education, why that didn't work. And so, well, the next slide has a lot of ideas from critical race theory that make it distinct from conventional civil rights. Boom. Monica. They're a lot smaller than they would be on that screen. But Monica, can you see any of these?
Some of them, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you recognize on here? Any of these you've heard of before, Monica? So some things on there, raise your hand. Race is a social construct. Have you heard that idea before? Intersectionality, have you heard that idea before? Some of these ideas get around a little bit. It's hard to say that they've infiltrated your schools and taken over everything, but they've been heard. What about colorblind racism? What about, that's good. What about interest convergence? What about the epistemological advantage of the marginalized? These are a little less common. Whiteness as property.
What's that?
Whiteness as property. Cheryl Harris, whiteness as property. You're studying your stuff. So some of these ideas are a lot less commonly heard about. Critical race theory includes a lot of these ideas that really push back on conventional civil rights ways of thinking and work towards ending racism. There's, for example, this idea of progress, how progress happens. And there's a conventional idea for so many people that our country is one that started with racism as a disease in an otherwise healthy nation, and it's a problem that we needed to extract. And that is kind of the logic in a lot of the civil rights change in terms of we just need to get rid of the racism in what's otherwise working. And critical race theorists describe racism as ordinary, as embedded in the way the United States has worked from the beginning. And so with that idea, it treats how to address racism very differently from someone who thinks, well, it's something that we just step by step, we're getting better and better, and eventually it'll be gone. So very different ways of approaching this unjust relationship between race, racism, and power when you're using critical race theory as a lens. As someone who grew up black in the U.S., a lot of what I read about in critical race theory put language to what I understood from experience of myself and people in my community. And so it made sense. And so, as I am a Christian, I read the Bible, I say, okay, how might this lens help me when I'm constructing meaning from the Bible? So, Genesis 15, story called The Call of Abram. We're going to look at that story, and we're going to think about it with this idea of justice and critical race theory as our guide. So, you all have Bibles. I'm not sure if you're going to get reception right now, but I'm going to read it out loud. So this is from the New International Version. I want you to think about that idea of justice in your head as I'm reading through this, because that's where we're going to go with this. How are we going to approach this with justice in mind? Again, justice is a process where people decide and create conditions for all of us to thrive, and it means including those who are most marginalized by or most impacted by those conditions. So, Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Avram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Avram. I'm your shield, your very great reward. But Avram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Avram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then God said to him, so shall be your offspring. He believed him, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Avram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Avram brought these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Avram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Avram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Avram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So, we read this text, and where do we focus our attention. We're thinking about justice. Where do we focus our attention? Well, almost always, it might be always. If you read a commentary, you hear a sermon, we're going to focus our attention on Father Abraham, on Avram. I'm guessing, but this has to be true. Danielle, have you talked about this text before? Did you talk about him passing through and the covenant, understanding Jewish culture, understanding the ancient world, understanding how covenants work, seeing what God is doing? That's great. It's a good message. But if we're thinking about justice, I don't think Avram is the one who's most impacted by current conditions. He is very wealthy at this point. He has a relationship with God at this point. God hasn't given him what he wants yet, but he's got a lot. Who is most impacted by current conditions? I've introduced this idea to my students, and they pointed me to, good job, Kwame, the servant, Eliezer. They didn't point me there, though. My bad. They pointed me to the animals. Oh. There we go. They pointed me to the animals. I said, I didn't even think about that, but yes, that's a pretty tough impact. They get slaughtered, right? Another place you can point, if you're thinking about who's most adversely impacted, are the people of the land. The Canaanites, the sin of the Amorites hasn't reached its full measure. The Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, all these people who are being dispossessed, right? I wanted them to turn, Kwame, to Eliezer. Those are both good, and you can take that direction. And today, I'm going to talk about the servant, the enslaved person, who, when this story happens, Avram is saying, the problem is that I don't have any kids. Eliezer's going to inherit. We got to get him out of the way. Because God's covenant can't go through Eliezer. It's got to go through my own son. Someone from my own body. And so, what happens when we read the same text and we have that idea of justice and we turn to Eliezer? So one thing we'll think about is, what are the conditions that are impacting him? And the most obvious is slavery. He is described in some translations as a servant. If you think about the Hebrew language, you have this one Hebrew word, eved, that has a range of meanings, from just a way to talk about a hierarchy to talking about a servant not actually owned by somebody else, or talking about different types of forced labor, what we would call slavery. And so if you look in the text in the Bible, you see in Exodus a certain type of forced labor where men, Exodus 21, you see men, if they're in debt, they can go into forced labor, a form of slavery, for a period of years, like 6 years. And then in the 7th year, they go free. But right after that, in Exodus 21, it says, but if they're a female, if it's your daughter that you're putting into forced labor to pay your debt, she doesn't go free. Well, that's one type of forced labor called debt slavery. Deuteronomy 15 says the exact same law, but slightly differently. It says male or female, they both go free in the 7th year. So one type of forced labor is that. But that's not what Eliezer is going through. Another type of forced labor is the type of slavery that we see in the Exodus story for the Israelites. What Pharaoh imposes, slavery, harsh labor, building his cities. It's also what Solomon does later. It's also what Solomon does later. In 1 Samuel 8, the people all want a king. They say, we want a king to rule over us like the others, like everybody else has a king. And Samuel's like, God, please don't do this. And God's like, fine, don't worry. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. You can let them have a king. Just give them this message. And so Samuel gives them this message. And the message is, you can have a king, but kings bring a lot of baggage. And that includes that they're going to take your sons and they're going to take your daughters. And your daughters are going to work for them baking food. And your sons are going to work for them building their palaces. And that's a certain type of forced labor that happens in the Bible. It's called the corvée system. So that's one term for it. It's for a period of a year, maybe it's a few months, they work for the king, don't get paid for that, and then they go back to whatever their thing is. That's also not what Eliezer is going through. There's one more type, and that's in Leviticus 25, and it's reserved for the foreigners. It says, in Leviticus 25, it says, if one of your fellow Israelites is going through tough times, don't make them a slave. Pay them. If you want to enslave people, go get it from the foreigners, from the other nations around you. That's who you can take. And when you have them as a slave, you can keep them for life. Your kids can inherit them. That's chattel slavery. That's the type of slavery. That's the type of labor system that was the same chattel slavery in the United States. There's real differences. They didn't have an idea of race. But there's a lot of similarities that make it look horrific. That's what Eliezer is going through. Abram describes him as a son of my house. Perhaps you've heard people introduced in the Bible as the son of their dad. Isaac, the son of Abraham, right? Eliezer is described as the son of Avram's property. That means he's somebody who was born into slavery in Abram's household with his other possessions. And you get an idea in the previous chapter that he's got about 300 men, it seems, of this kind, plus he's got women of this kind. So you take this lens, you look at this story, and you want to understand what his conditions are like. What is it like for Eliezer? Why? Because it makes the Bible look worse? No. Because when you understand what's going on in this text, it might make a difference for how you understand the real world and what real people are going through. You can't help a character in the text. You can't help Eliezer. But there are people in the real world who you can make a difference for. Turning our attention there changes the way we read the Bible. So, you understand the system of his slavery more. You would understand that ways of thinking are a big part of the slavery that Eliezer is afflicted with. Ideologies, worldviews. I'm sorry, I'm just remembering. In your values, you mentioned ideology as one of the things that you care about correcting, right? In the values yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. If you care about the ideologies that are toxic in the world, it's helpful to understand when those things are showing up in the Bible. What Eliezer is going through is because there's an ideology in the Bible that forced labor is something that needs to happen sometimes, but foreigners, those who aren't us, deserve it in a worse way than those who are in the in-group. That's an ideology that harms Eliezer. If you think about it with intersectionality, then you understand Eliezer is facing more than an Israelite would in his enslavement, but you also turn an eye to what women are facing. What Hagar is going to face in the very next chapter, forced surrogacy. That's something Eliezer is not going to have to suffer through, right? So when we turn our attention toward Eliezer, we see some different things in this text that are important for us to address. We also can think about Eliezer's perspective, the epistemological advantage of the marginalized. This is this idea that those who experience oppression have a better lens for seeing what's going on and how it works. Kwame read a poem by Langston Hughes. I was going to read another one by Langston Hughes, so that was pretty cool. In 2020, a lot of people recognized that black people were telling the truth when we said, police brutality is horrible, it's a real thing, it's happening all the time. And they said that because they saw it on the video, right? In 2014, a lot of people had said that before. Oh, that was their awakening moment. Maybe, was it 91, Rodney King? 91 with Rodney King. Maybe that was their awakening moment. But black people have been saying this for a long time. 1949, Langston Hughes, a poem called Who But the Lord. I looked and I saw that man they call the law. He was coming down the street at me. I had visions in my head of being laid out, cold and dead, or else murdered by the third degree. I said, "Oh Lord, if you can, save me from that man. Don't let him make a pope out of me." But the Lord, he was not quick. The law raised up his stick and beat the living hell out of me. Now, I don't understand why God don't protect a man from police brutality. Being poor and black, I have no weapon to strike back. So who but the Lord can protect me? We'll see. That was 1949 he was saying that. This epistemological advantage of the oppressed, this idea that those who are suffering have their story to tell. And we can listen to their story and see things that we might not see if we're not facing the same thing, right? If we turn our attention to Eliezer, we can see the same story from a very different perspective. And we can make meaning of it from a different perspective. Pastor Danielle, you've introduced them to Will Gaffney's work. That's correct. Will Gaffney challenges us to read these same stories with our perspective turned to women who are marginalized from the main center of attention, from the spotlight, saying, what will this story look like if we pay attention to women? Not only that, but from Jewish tradition, we have this idea of midrash. From Christian tradition, at least in the Black church, we have our sanctified imagination. We know that we can read these texts and we can say, these are the words in the text, and I imagine that the story went something like this for so-and-so, and bring more life to the story and add more details to the story. What if we add details about Eliezer's life? In chapter 14, so we just saw Eliezer enslaved in Avram's house from Damascus. That's all we get about him. In chapter 14, we saw that Avram went to save his nephew. His nephew was captured, and Avram got together a troop of 300 men born in his house. These are enslaved people that Avram has, and they go out and fight. Was Eliezer the leader? Maybe, I don't know. He seems like he was a part of it, probably. It said they went fighting to get his nephew Lot back, and they went as far as past Damascus. What do you think happened when he went past Damascus? What was going through his mind? Is he saying, well, I could run away maybe, but what do I have in Damascus? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he does have relationships with family still there. Maybe he was thinking, well, I've got favor with Avram. I've been doing right by him for so long. Maybe things will go my way if I'm faithful. But then you get to this text, and what happens? Avram pleads to God. Yeah, he hasn't argued with God yet. Now he's pleading with God. Don't let it be the case that Eliezer inherits after me. That's what this is coming down to, God. You made these promises. Don't let it go through him. What happens if we read the story imaginatively, creatively, from his perspective? The last part about this I want to bring up is that the text can speak. One more thing about that. If we're thinking creatively about this text, and we're thinking with Eliezer centered, we're thinking from his perspective, we might imagine that Abraham could have acted differently. Abraham is somebody who right now is talking back to God. He's somebody who, when God says in Genesis 18, I'm going to go destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he talks back to God over and over and over and over. And God, he says, are you going to destroy a whole city because there's these wicked people? What if there's 50 righteous people? And God says, no, not if there's 50. And he says, what if, there's just 10 less than 50? Is that really that big of a deal? And he goes back again and again and again. What if Avram wanted to go with God and make different plans? We could think that God just tells Avram what the deal is, and that's how he follows things. But that's not how Genesis works. Actually, at the very beginning of his story, if you go to Genesis 12, when God calls Abram out of Ur, that's not the beginning of Abram's story. His story actually began in chapter 11. And when it began in chapter 11, it said, Avram lived in Ur, his brother died, his dad took them to head to Canaan. And then they stop in Haran. They don't make it to Canaan. And his dad dies. So when God calls Avram and says, you go to the place I'm taking you to, where do they end up? Canaan. The same place his family had tried to take him before. His dad had tried to take him before. There's something about God partnering with Avram in Genesis. It's not just God telling him what to do. What if Avram didn't have this idea that Eliezer as a slave needs to be pushed aside for God's blessing to come true? What if he didn't have that idea? This story might be very different. All right, so the last thing, what else does the text say? Well, when we read with Eliezer centered, the problem in the text is not what every commentary says the problem is. I look at all these Genesis commentaries, and over they say the problem is that Abram has no kids yet, that God made a promise and he still hasn't given him any kids. Or the problem is that Abram doesn't have faith that God's going to give him kids. If you read from Eliezer's perspective, you say the problem is that Avram can't imagine God's promises going through enslaved Eliezer instead of his own son. He knows that that's potentially what could happen. He thinks that's what's going to happen, but he can't imagine that would be right, that would be the way that God should work. It's a very different problem. But now the text says something different. There's this part in the text that a lot of lectionaries will skip over because it's not a pretty part. God makes the promise. God goes through the blood. Avram sets up the whole covenant. And God makes the covenant, and God speaks during that covenant. And part of what God says is that Avram's descendants are going to suffer. Verse 13, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. Most commentaries read that and say, well, this is just God predicting the future, so Avram knows the future, what's going to happen. But if Avram's problem is that he can't fathom that God's covenant will go through the enslaved Eliezer, now God's words actually say something very different. It's not going to work out for Eliezer. That's too bad. But the idea that God's chosen people wouldn't be the enslaved, well, God just said, your people, your descendants, you're trying to get it away from an enslaved person. Actually, your descendants are going to be enslaved for 400 years. And that's who the covenant's going to be through. That's who the chosen people are going to be. In fact, it's going to be so important that when they're told to love their neighbors, they're going to be told to love their neighbors because you know what it was like to be enslaved in Egypt. So the message of the story changes when you read it from a different perspective. All of this is to say, why read the Bible if I'm going to critique the main characters, even critique God? Why not just give up on the Bible? Well, when you read with this perspective, like I said, we're constructing meaning from the text. We actually do get different meanings out of the text. So I think it is valuable if you can, and that was a surprise for me. I didn't think that I would see that when I first started. I thought, of course, when I do this and I critique the text, I'm going to see some things about slavery. I'm going to see ideologies that are problematic. But I didn't think I was going to see a verse where if you read it with the perspective I brought, God says something different than what I came in thinking it was going to say. Why still do this? How we interpret the Bible is related to how we live our lives. I'm not going to say it's a one-to-one, but I do a Bible study. It's just like a one-on-one with a kid who I've known since he was really little. And the other day, the last time that we did it, or a few times ago, he asked me about Judas. He said, why did Judas betray Jesus? And I said, well, there's lots of ways you can think about it. But some people think of Judas as Satan, as the worst person ever, and he did it. But there have been some people who have thought more creatively. Who's seen Jesus Christ Superstar? Right? Judas and Jesus had a good relationship that went sour because Judas couldn't understand how Jesus is being misunderstood by others, how his mission is turning into people worshiping him instead of believing in what he believed in, right? I talked to him about that. I showed him a poem by County Cullen where Judas's mom dotes over her baby because people tend to like their kids, at least for a while. And we went through that poem, we talked through it, and in that poem, Judas and Jesus have a relationship where Jesus says, I'm going to give you a task, Judas, to betray me. And after that, I know everyone's going to hate you, but if you love me, that's what you'll do. And Judas does it. And County Cullen wrote this before anyone knew about the Gospel of Judas, where ancient people actually thought of the exact same idea. You can read these stories differently and think of people differently, and it might change the way you think of people who do the wrong thing. Right? How we read, how we interpret influences how we live our lives. If we are not intentional and creative with the Bible, we continue to pass down stories. Well, if we do read the Bible and pass it down. We continue to pass down stories where there's things ingrained in it that we have not gotten out. We haven't talked about. And we're just passing those ideas with the stories. So if we take this perspective, hopefully we can at least unpack them, and we won't necessarily like everything we find, but it gives us a chance to wrestle with it and make the Bible meaningful as the Word of God for our communities. Thank you.